Good morning and welcome to another webcast by Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Today's webcast is about expanding your 501c3 enterprise, and we are grateful to have Rupert Burkhoff, a partner at Kilpatrick Stockton, to speak with you today. I'm Robin Miller, a staff attorney at Pro Bono Partnership. First, before we get started, we want to thank Georgia Legal Services for providing this webcast service for us. And we'd also like to mention that the information we're providing today is not legal advice, but general information that hopefully will help guide your nonprofit as you move forward in your activities. Hopefully you've downloaded the presentation materials, and at slide 2 we have our mission for Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. The mission of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is to provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We match eligible organizations with volunteer lawyers from leading corporations and law firms in Atlanta who can assist nonprofits with their business law matters. I also want to mention, which is described more fully at slide 3, the eligibility requirements to be a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. You must be a 501c3 nonprofit organization. You must be located or serve the greater metro Atlanta area, which has quite a wide berth. And you must serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals and be unable to afford your own legal services. Should you fall into those eligibility requirements and be interested in receiving free legal services through our organization, please visit us at our website, which is listed on slide 3, which is pbpatl.org. And with that, I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Burkhoff, who's going to discuss our issues today.
Thank you, Robin, and it's an honor to be here today. Just a quick second about my own background and why this is an interesting subject to me. My area of expertise, we're not supposed to say specialty here in Georgia, is franchising. And it occurred to me, but I was a corporate lawyer by training, and it occurred to me a couple of years ago that there were great similarities to the needs of 501c3s as they expand to a franchise company, where franchising basically is a method of distribution where you take the capital and financial resources of another party and you bring them to your aid so that the franchise or the company that controls the situation, like McDonald's, for example, can grow in a much more rapid manner than they could if they relied solely upon internal resources. As the slide should show, we got a few subjects we're going to cover today. First of all, we're going to take just a minute or two and talk about what is expansion. Then we're going to talk about why you should expand. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the different models for expansion, as well as look at some of the factors to consider to try to basically build your own appropriate model. And then finally, I'll turn the program over to Robin, who will talk about some of the tax considerations that you as a 501c3 will need to keep in mind as you try to develop a program for expansion. Let me note, however, it's going to appear a little bit in this program today like my thoughts are somewhat random, and that's because this is somewhat of a new area. It's not one where I can put you in touch with various resources that have the answer. Even when we talk about models today, you have to remember that while we're not going to give an exact template, because there really is not a template, these are only suggestions as to factors that you would want to consider if you try to grow your model. The Chinese used to have a saying with respect to the not the narrow suit, but the Mao suit, that one size fits none. And I think that's true in this area as well. You're going to find that you're going to have peculiarities of your own group, the politics, your sources, and the like, which you'll have to take in consideration in trying to go ahead and build your model. And with that, let's go to our first subject, which is what do we mean by expansion? And I'm actually going to go, based upon the slide here, we're going to go backwards. We're going to define it by telling you what it's not. First of all, what we're not talking about today, that is, first of all, we're not talking about just basically growing your revenue stream. Last year I earned, my company earned $100,000, not earned, but had revenues of that, and this year we're going to have $200,000. That's not the issue, although you will find, as part of expansion, one of the hopes would be that you would increase the revenue. Secondly, we're not going to talk about expanding your line of services or product lines either. For example, if you were in the nursing home area, we're not going to talk about moving from that to hospices or perhaps to other types of home health care. We're going to work on the assumption today that you like the line of services or products that you're supplying to your customer base, and that you're going to stick with them in trying to grow the system. Third thing we're not talking about here is building up your own corporate infrastructure. That is, adding more staff, more facilities, and so forth. That too might be a byproduct of what you will need to do to expand, but that's not the center of a focus. What we are going to focus, going back to the top of the slide, is to the issue of new geographical markets offering same services products. By definition, the audience today are Atlanta-based or metropolitan Atlanta-based 501c3s, and what we're talking about here is taking your products or services to other geographical areas, for example, Charlotte, Baltimore, West Coast, or what have you, and some of the ways you can structure those types of growth situations. First question I think you really need to ask yourself is, why or should I expand? And maybe there are various purposes for that, and sometimes people look at things different ways. In preparing for today, I recalled a show that appeared on Twilight Zone many, many moons ago, where aliens come down to Earth, and they come out wearing these big sort of officious black robes, and they come down and they get rid of war and famine and pestilence and disease and make food grow better and so forth. And they always carry with them this big black book, which has some strange foreign language on that. And the Earth people, of course, are very thrilled to see that how the planet has changed and how these people seem to be so benevolent in what they're doing. As the show progresses, there's curiosity about what the book is there. And so one person has the book translated, and the title of it is To Serve Man. And of course that sounds very nice and again very benevolent or so, but when they develop the rest of the book or translate it, it turns out that it's a cookbook. And obviously the motives of these folks were quite different from what the humans saw their motives as being. And so you really have to sit down and figure out why, if you're going to expand, or why are you going to expand? What is your purpose there? And people really, as I said before, have different motives out there. But one thing I've observed is that people who work with the 501c3s, traditionally, most of them, it's not a job. It's more of what I would call a passion to take their mission, what their objective is, and to try to go ahead and give it to a group which is larger than they have currently. It is, the phrase I like to say, it's their baby, and they want to make sure that it grows properly as part of that, and various reasons. Sometimes, as I said, it's passion. Sometimes it's a question of pride and the like. There are more specific ways that we can look at this, though. First thing is to make your brand more valuable. One of the interesting things, having come from a franchise background, is you become more sensitive to the business needs when you're trying to grow a system. And brand recognition is something where I'm not sure, because of lack of experience, how important that is viewed in the 501c3 experience. In the corporate area, you'll find, for example, let's take a difference between two brands, which most Atlantans would know: Waffle House, a local company, a local base company, and the Varsity, also a local company. And you look at their patterns of growth. The Varsity, of course, is very successful, but now there are probably 2, 3, or 4, or 5 of them. And of course, everyone, when you think of the Varsity, the first thought is not the Varsity Junior, but the one over on North Avenue. Compare that to Waffle House example, however. In Waffle House, you have some 1,500 or 1,600 units. And while it's not a national concept, certainly anyone who's driven up or down 75 or 85 sees at least every 2 or 3 exits you'll find one. And because of that, the Waffle House brand, I would argue, is probably a lot more valuable than the Varsity brand is out there. And having a brand is important, because if you have that recognition out there, there are a lot of other opportunities that are welcome to you. For example, if your 501c3 is perhaps advocacy based, it gives you a better opportunity to influence policy. people will listen to you because they know about your company and its reputation. It gives you little open doors on the solicitation side. You'll find institutional donors are going to be more receptive to you if they've heard of it. Similarly, if you're going out to corporate donors, I think you'll have better access in those circumstances. And of course, your brand can be both local and it can be national as well, depending upon sort of what strategy that you follow here. Another reason, and this one we touched on before and said it was a byproduct, is to increase the revenues of the group. Obviously, if you're doing fundraising and you're doing fundraising in Atlanta, you'll have a certain number, but if you're doing fundraising in Atlanta and in Birmingham or Charlotte, for example, your opportunities to have more funds will obviously increase. So that a presence in those two markets would certainly work to your advantage in that regard. And obviously, you know, the advantages of having more revenues are pretty obvious. I don't think we have to go into those today. And finally, the other reason I think why expansion is good is that it does create economies of scale for the group, for the 501c3. Particularly true of a product line. For example, if you're producing a product for the public, you can probably do it more cheaply if you're going to have a higher volume of that. But there are other advantages too, particularly on the buying side. For example, if you have to deal with a supplier, be it stationery or any type of inventory, you'll probably be able to get a better price if you have a larger volume out there. Service industry is the same thing. For example, with a supplier like FedEx or UPS, if you guarantee them a higher volume of business, they'll probably cut you a better rate. And there are other operational areas too. For example, one that comes to mind is training as an area where you probably can do economies of scale, particularly if you have to go outside of your organization and hire outside talent. They might be willing to give you a better deal as well if you're going to be doing 2, 3, or 5 programs rather than just one. And then finally, the other area that comes to mind here is marketing. If you need marketing materials, of course you can do it cheaper. You may be able to media buys if you are in a position to do that more effectively if you're going into different markets out there. So the bottom line there is that why expand? There are several reasons to go ahead and take that approach. Now, let's get down to a little bit more of the practical aspects, which is how do you structure your organization? And as the slide shows, there are really sort of 3 models out there that I'm aware of. And as I said earlier, remember the Mao suit, one size fits none. And these are only sort of basic templates. And we'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages. But just to begin it off, there are 3 that I've really sort of identified or seen used. The first one is what I'll call the one level, where I'll use the word national. It doesn't have to be national. Second one is the chapter model, which is a very traditional one. You'll see that quite frequently. For example, the American Cancer Society uses that approach. I don't know about the Red Cross. They may also do that. And then the third model is what I'll call the new kid on the block, and it's the franchise model. And I will say that you can accomplish most of what you accomplish under either of the second or third models. The first one's quite a bit different. So to some degree, the distinctions between it are artificial, but there are some substantive points as well. Let's go back now and talk about the one-level system. And as I said before, it can be national, regional, or local in scope. And the main thing is it's sort of one office out there. There's no geographic infrastructure. For example, generally if you went to Birmingham and you were based in Atlanta, you would not have an office in Birmingham. You wouldn't find that out there. Another element which is critical is central control. Usually, because it is only one level, it's a somewhat simple model, and the decisions are all made at the headquarters. Again, I'll call it the national headquarters, and they're enforced or carried out under the direct supervision of the national office. On the finance side, always a critical issue. You have the situation where that's under control also. Usually it's sort of one bank account out there rather than having multiple bank accounts that we'll talk about in a second. The services or products will be supplied really anywhere by the enterprise from that same office. And one of the interesting factors here is that if you're a membership-based organization, membership, of course, can be from whatever geographical area that you decide for the group to cover out there. A couple of the advantages of the one-level model. The first one is simplicity. There's not a lot of hierarchy in it, although as the group moves, you might find that to be the case. It also means, of course, probably lower administrative costs, something that's always important to 501c3s. You may find one of the disadvantages of it is relates to the issue of personal involvement. A person in California, for example, may be less enthusiastic about contributing to a group which is based in the Atlanta area. Thus, you have a challenge in meeting that one. Going back to the question of branding, which I will hit on another couple times during the course of today's presentation, it's easy to control the brand because of the simplicity of the arrangement. But one of the other problems I've spotted here in these arrangements is how do you get the message out? Is it going to be done by marketing? You don't have that local presence in the other areas, and there, of course, are advantages as well as disadvantages to following that approach. Let's turn now to the chapter model, and I said this is the very traditional one. And again, keep in mind that there are no sacred deities in a lot of the things I'll say. You see them structured quite differently. One of the critical things, just as a starting point, is what I'll call the basic element of creation of the group. And in a chapter model, you'll find that it's either the articles of organization, depending upon whether it's incorporated or not, and usually a document called bylaws or perhaps operating arrangements or so forth. Sometimes you'll also find that these principles are also further supplemented by some type of operations manual, where which is really much more down to the nuts and bolts, like, for example, how you would have a local meeting out there. Generally, the model itself has a national board set up, which can have it has representatives on it, like any board, and somewhere in the documents themselves will say what the rules are for electing that board. Infrastructure. On infrastructure, generally the rules come from the national, although it is possible to set up the board, which creates sort of the national headquarters, to make those decisions themselves at that point, and then the decisions that are made are carried down to the local chapters. It is at the local level that these activities are implemented. Governance, usually a chapter will have its own officials out there. It could have its own structure as a legal entity. That's not common, I think. Or alternatively, more important, is that the group itself, the national group, will go ahead and set forth some basic criteria about, for example, board size, perhaps board eligibility, certainly the scope of the activities that the group will be permitted to engage in. And of course, whenever you have local governance, you start having questions about who's in charge at those levels, how are directors or board members chosen, and the more details like what are the terms, when are elections held, and so forth, and of course who has the right to vote. One of the interesting things about working with 501c3s is that the corporate codes under which most entities are created are extremely flexible on rules about membership. For example, from a pure legal perspective, a entity which is a 501c3 doesn't have to have any members at all, and its board can be self-perpetuating, which of course is quite different from the commercial model that you would see. It can have membership classes, and it can give voting rights to members, or it can not have memberships have any rights in the operations of the company. But it is common, I think, in the chapter model that there is some type of a representation process where the national is comprised of representatives from the local groups who might be elected or appointed according to whatever rules that the bylaws might say. Examples, as I said, one was American Cancer Society that has quite elaborate regional setups. Another one are both the Alcoholics Anonymous and the Overeaters Anonymous, are groups that have extremely large amount of local autonomy, but they still work on the chapter model. One of the problems frequently, but it's more practical than theoretical, is that in most of these groups, they don't put proper controls over the brand itself into the organizational documents. The national clearly has the right to control the use of the brand itself, but it's usually not very well documented on what controls can be placed on the chapters. And one of the questions that you need to ask under this model, as well as under the franchising one, is that if you have a recalcitrant, that is someone who does not want to play by the rules, how do you go ahead and either get them to play by the rules, or how do you get them out of the organization? Frequently, these are handled in a very nebulous way in the chapter model.
There's a question before you continue. One viewer asks, since they may be in different locations in these models, can board members meet virtually or over the phone for a board of directors meeting?
Very good question. And the answer is, if you're an unincorporated group, it's whatever your bylaws will say, what the rules would be, and that's something that should be covered in those. If you happen to be an incorporated organization, generally the rules are set forth in the Articles of Incorporation or in the corporate code, generally in the corporate code itself. And in most jurisdictions, they do permit boards to meet telephonically as long as the participants can hear each other as part of the conversation. Okay. The franchising model. As I said earlier, this is the new kid on the block here, and it's one that we're kind of experimenting with right now. I have two of my pro bono clients who are trying to follow this model, and it's interesting to watch as they kind of struggle through to bring it into fruition. But one of the major differences here, at least from the legal standpoint, is that a franchising model is based upon a contractual relationship as opposed to internal governance. The results may be the same, but if you have a problem in the relationship, you look to the contract. I'll refer to it sometimes as a franchise agreement or a licensing agreement. There's not much magic in the name for the solution of the problems that exist between the, we'll call them the licensee and the licensor. The licensor being the person who grants the license to the franchisee to act on his behalf. And so you're looking at that document rather than the Articles of Incorporation. And usually in these models, I would say, certainly what I would recommend, is that you will set up a legal entity in the local area that will act as the local sort of representative of the group itself, as opposed to in the chapter model where you could have a local entity, but I think it's more customary for them to really just be part of the overall umbrella association. And when you allow them to have a local entity, almost implicitly you're saying that you're going to have much more autonomy in the way you operate. That's not necessarily the case. And ultimately the rules of engagement between the licensor and the licensee will be, as I said before, set forth in the license agreement. Some of the critical issues that you need to think about if you are thinking about using the franchise model. First one is finances, and associated with that are income stream. In a commercial franchise, usually there are some fees paid by the licensee to the licensor. It might be a royalty, it could be a flat amount. Sometimes there's a membership fee to join the group, and of course it could be other revenue streams if you are selling products or services or making them available, I really should say, to the ultimate client base out there. But by the way, let me mention is that from a pure legal standpoint, a 501c3 would be legally a franchise, which would subject it to substantial regulation. But since it's not involved in a commercial purpose, generally it falls outside of this whole regulatory scheme that helps put food on the table for my family out there. Finances, though, you will find, for example, that because you're an entity, now you can go ahead and open up a bank account. I happen to serve as a treasurer for a local chapter of one organization, and the bank account is basically a drawer in my house, which has not substantial amounts of cash, but cash in there, which I kind of keep aside, and I have to write personal checks because we can't open up a bank account because we're not an organization out there. Governance issues. Again, when you allow the franchise or the licensee autonomy, you're giving them almost an implicit right to set up the governance. But on the other hand, you can, in your license agreement, put some strictures on that if you want to. One of the other advantages, I think, of the franchise model is it does allow you to have local involvement very easily because it is their agent, their entity themselves. And in the commercial setting, what I've found is that just using the word franchise in itself gives a certain amount of value to the enterprise itself. Brand protection issues, those will be covered in the license agreement. For example, how you want to be able to display the trademark or service mark to the public out there, and you'll have some details about what they can and cannot do with the mark. That's usually not something that's spelled out when you have the chapter model. You usually will have specific rules about how you can undo the relationship if it's not working out, and you'll also perhaps have some rules about how, if you want to modify the system or the program itself, how it can be done. These are all handled in the franchise agreement itself. Overall direction of the enterprise, and when I say the enterprise, I'm talking about the entire system. One of the more significant differences between what I'll call the franchise model and the chapter model is that the franchisor itself is independent, and it might, for example, have a control process which does not involve in any way the local chapters. In other words, it makes the rules and it puts the rules out there, and unlike the local chapters where usually there is more of a representative system, the franchisor or licensor in these circumstances can really be an entity to itself out there. One of the critical differences in the area, though, from a pure legal standpoint, is on the question of vicarious liability. Vicarious liability is a concept where essentially the actions of a second party can be attributed to the first party, so that if the second party acts in a way that's harmful to others, the first party might be responsible for the actions. And take, for example, in the commercial setting, somebody walks into a local McDonald's and they slip and fall. They're going to first of all think about suing the person who owns that unit if it's a franchised one, and under some circumstances the franchisor or licensor might be held liable. If you have a chapter model, there really is not this distinction between the two levels, so that the national group, as I call them, will be likely for the actions of the local group as a general proposition. When you have a franchise or license agreement, usually there'll be a provision there that says that the licensee is an independent contractor and has no power to bind the licensor, and the licensor shall not be responsible for the actions of the licensee. And if you maintain the proper, I'll call it decorum, in operating your business, it is more likely than not that the licensor won't be responsible unless the licensee were acting directly in accordance with the rules established by the licensor. And even then, there might be questions about the liability out there. So it does give you one more level of protection out there. Take another example is, suppose Robin is the operator of a local chapter or perhaps a licensee, and she goes out and she slanders a public official in a matter that would be where the public official could sue. The chances are, in the chapter model, is that the ultimate overall organization will be responsible for that. But unless the company had a policy that we were going to take aggressive action against state officials, it's not likely that the parent, the licensor, will be responsible for Robin's deviations from norms. So in summary then, and then I'll turn the program over to Robin, some of the key issues out there, one of which is governance. You know, how is the overall organization going to be controlled, or if you're using the franchise model, what type of controls are you going to put over the licensee or franchisee? Revenue allocation is another issue that has to be addressed. We really haven't talked about that here. Finance control, very important one, because you don't want chapters, local chapters, or licensees to put themselves in a position where they can't pay their debts out there. Brand control, again, that's another issue that has to be addressed under either of the last two models. An interesting one is who owns the intellectual property. One of the advantages of using the franchise model is that it's very clear, typically under the agreement, that the licensor or franchisor will own the intellectual property, and that the licensee is only authorized to use it consistent with the terms of the license agreement. And then finally, degree of local participation and autonomy given to the parties. And of course, as I said, there's great variety under either of the two models. One of the things of dealing with 501c3s that always has to be taken into account are tax considerations, because of course you never want to do anything that would be that would jeopardize the 501c3 standing of the parties. And that's an area where I don't consider myself expert, but I am joined today by someone who is in that area. So, Robin, I'll give the floor to you at this point.
I have a quick question before you move on. Sorry. One viewer asks, who can a nonprofit turn to for branding help? Is that an attorney or an advertising professional?
That's a question which is very easy to answer. I always say that if an attorney gives you advice in the area of marketing, you have two alternatives. One of which is you should absolutely ignore it, or B, you should do just the opposite. Being serious, some lawyers are quite good at marketing instincts, particularly if they have a good experience base. But generally, lawyers have not been trained in that area. I mean, for example, I'm always fascinated. I do a lot of work with the restaurant industry, and I always wonder about how they come up with campaigns, discount campaigns or buy one, get one free, and how they want to get the media messages out there. And there are companies that do marketing. And marketing, by the way, is a little different than advertising. Marketing is really a broader term. So the answer to the question, after having gone through all that, is that you ought to be looking at getting a marketing or advertising company to really help you out. But in more seriousness, it depends on really the skills of the lawyer and experiences with them dealing in these areas.
Thank you. Robin?
Well, let's spend a few minutes talking about the tax considerations, and they very much tie into everything that Rupert just described, because it will entirely depend on the model in which you choose to go with for your expansion, if you choose to expand your organization. And so that leads directly into the first bullet point, controlling your scope of your local enterprises. The most important thing at the end of the day for any 501c3 organization that's trying to expand is making sure that whenever expansion you engage in will not diminish your status as a tax-exempt 501c3 organization. So you need to make sure that you in no way will jeopardize that status, as Rupert mentioned. And you also want to consider whether it will jeopardize your reputation. So you have to have those critical aspects in your head as you create which model you think will work best for you. And then around that model, what structures you're going to add onto it as you drill down and actually create the lower level organizations. The next bullet point is applying for 501c3 status. And again, it will depend on which model you choose. If you're going to go with a franchise type model, then really what you're doing is you are licensing the right to use your organization and your aspects to another organization, and that organization will set up its own incorporation or some kind of documents, as Rupert said. It may not even incorporate, but they will by contract have the ability to work with you. They will have to have their own 501c3 status if they want to be a charitable organization. You're just by contract working with them. So they're entirely separate. The next sort of level we talked about was chapters. And in the chapter environment, that kind of depends. There's several different options that a chapter structure can go with. It can be either its own 501c3 organization, or it can also fall under a group exemption, which is a bit more complicated for a national organization, but it does give the national organization a certain level of control. So there's pros and cons in that area. So I'm going to jump down to group exemptions and then go back up to applying for 501c3 status in a minute. Under the group exemption, the way that works is that you have a central organization that has its 501c3 status and has applied using its Form 1023 to get that. They then create or apply for what's called a group exemption, and they list out the subordinate organizations that will fall under that group exemption. There's a significant level of control and supervision that's required to get a group exemption, and that is control and supervision of the subordinate organizations. The subordinate organizations don't need to be incorporated. They can be incorporated. And that goes back to what Rupert was discussing, that there's fluidity there. But they must have, within whatever organizing documents they have, very specific, similar structure and purpose to the central organization. So all of the subordinate organizations will be similarly structured and similarly operated and have a similar purpose. And that all has to be documented. In addition, that subordinate organization has to submit a letter to the central organization saying, yes, we want to fall under your group exemption. In addition, none of the subordinates can be private foundations. They all have to be public charities. And there's additional information that is required of the subordinates to be turned in every year to the central organization. One of the key factors here is that that central organization needs to make sure that those subordinate organizations are complying with all the requirements, because it's a group exemption. So what happens with these other organizations can affect directly the status, the 501c3 status of the central organization. So there has to be a certain level of control and supervision. In addition, there's a requirement by the central organization that at least 90 days prior to the end of the fiscal year of the central organization, they have to submit a letter to the IRS listing out all of its subordinates, so that the IRS is aware of and understands who are the subordinates under this group exemption. The next question, which can go either way and touches on the finance issue that Rupert mentioned, is whether or not the subordinates have to complete their own Form 990 or whether they can submit their information and do it through the central organization. And that is a decision by each organization to decide. The central organization can want to have more control over the finances and request all of the information and then roll it up into one group application, or they can have each one submit their own.
Robin, will you define subordinates, that you keep using that term?
Subordinate organization are these sort of chapters that Rupert mentioned. So let's say the central organization is located here in Atlanta, and then you're going to set up a chapter in Charlotte. That Charlotte chapter would be what's called a subordinate under the group exemption. And you could have multiple subordinates throughout the country. A good example of that, and granted it's not a C3 organization, but many people are familiar with fraternity and sorority structures, and those are very much the group exemption model. A lot of churches are also set up under a group exemption model, but again, churches have a variety of freedoms when it comes to requirements of what they have to submit to the IRS. So I'm not going to go into that example in detail. So going back to each subordinate, the problem with the group exemption is each subordinate does not have its own 501c3 determination letter because they have not applied for independent 501c3 status. They have their C3 status by virtue of that central organization or national organization that they work very closely with. So the group exemption is one way in which you can set up a chapter model and easily expand without having to go through all of the work of applying for each chapter, of applying for its own 501c3 status. Chapter models can still do that 501c3 application and have them more separated and have less control over them. So you could have the national organization in Atlanta. You could have different chapters set up around the country, and each one could be its own independent organization. It may not be a franchise. That depends on the structure you decide to take but you could have it as still having its own independent existence and 501c3 status. Like Rupert said, there's no one size that fits all, and there's no size that fits anyone. So it's all very creative, and it really depends upon what the goals are of the national organization and how they want to expand and in what ways they want to expand. But again, the most important thing is protecting that 501c3 status. So in whichever model you go with, you need to make sure you have the good financial controls, good governance controls now as well, because the new Form 990s that have been in place for a year now require a lot of information about the governance of your organization, and so there needs to be good governance controls as well. And then the last thing to think about when you're talking about taxes is each state is very different when it comes to other tax issues. So what are the requirements to apply for state income tax exemption? in the state of North Carolina may be different from the state of Georgia, and that needs to be considered. In addition, there's different sales tax requirements in each state and different property tax requirements within the localities of each state. And so all those factors will ultimately need to be considered as your organization may grow and create chapters. Are there any other questions? Rupert, any other comments or thoughts?
No, I think we've pretty much covered the field today. And just to say again, you know, one size does not fit all. So don't go out there looking for the form book that's going to give you all the answers. Or if you find the form book, just keep in mind that a lot of these are decisions we made do go back to the cultural aspects of your 501c3.
Thank you.